Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that got buried twice, once in the mud of France and again in the history books back home. We're stepping into the trenches of World War I with the black American soldiers who fought for a country that refused to treat them as equals. These were men who left Jim Crow America to fight for democracy in Europe, who faced German artillery and American racism with the same stubborn determination, who came home as heroes in France and were told to forget their service the moment they stepped back on American soil. The trenches were hell for everyone who experienced them, but black soldiers fought that hell while carrying the additional weight of proving their humanity to people who had already decided they were less than. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with why you're here in the first place, because the path that led black Americans into the trenches of France was twisted with contradictions that would be funny if they weren't so painful. The year is 1917, and America has finally entered the war that's been chewing up Europe for 3 years. President Wilson talks about making the world safe for democracy, and the words ring hollow in black communities where democracy has never applied. You can't vote in most of the South. You can't drink from the same water fountains as white people. You can be lynched for looking at a white woman wrong, or for no reason at all, and the killers will walk free. This is the democracy you're being asked to die for. And yet, when the call comes, black men answer. They answer because they hope that military service will prove their worth, will earn them the citizenship they've been denied, will force white America to finally see them as men. They answer because the alternative is staying home and being called cowards. They answer because W.E.B. Du Bois himself tells them to close ranks, to put aside their grievances and fight, to believe that victory abroad might bring victory at home. It's a gamble, and history will show it's a losing one, but they don't know that yet. The draft doesn't discriminate, at least not in who it calls. Black men register alongside white men, and when the numbers are drawn, black men are selected at disproportionate rates. The draft boards in the South are all white, and they have quotas to fill. And guess whose names end up on the lists? Nearly 400,000 black Americans will serve during the war, about 13% of the total American force, though black people are only 10% of the population. The math tells its own story, but getting drafted is just the beginning of the indignities. When you report for training, you discover that the army has no intention of treating you as an equal. Black soldiers are segregated into separate units, housed in separate facilities, trained by officers who often don't want them and don't believe they can fight. The camps in the South are particularly brutal. You're surrounded by white civilians who resent your presence, who see a black man in uniform as an offense against the natural order, who will assault you, or worse, if you forget your place for a moment. The training itself is a study in contradiction. You're supposed to be preparing for combat, but the army isn't sure it wants you in combat. Most black soldiers are assigned to labor battalions, the services of supply, where you'll dig ditches, load cargo, build roads, bury the dead, and perform all the backbreaking work that keeps an army functioning. The assumption is that black men are suited for physical labor, but not for fighting, that you lack the intelligence and courage for combat, that you'll break under fire and endanger white soldiers. These assumptions are based on nothing but racism, on the same lies that have been told about black people for centuries, but they shape policy nonetheless. The labor battalions work brutal hours under conditions that would be called abuse if the workers were white. You unload ships at French ports, handling tons of supplies every day, your body aching from labor that never seems to end. You build roads through muddy French countryside, laying gravel and corduroying logs, creating the infrastructure that lets the fighting army move. You dig graves for the fallen, white and black together in death, even if they couldn't serve together in life. The work is essential, and everyone knows it, but it carries none of the glory that combat brings. Only about 40,000 black soldiers will actually serve in combat roles, and even getting that far requires fighting a bureaucratic war before you ever see the enemy. Black leaders lobby, petition, and pressure the War Department to allow black men to prove themselves in battle. The NACP campaigns for black combat units and black officers to lead them. There's a training camp established at Fort Des Moines specifically to create black officers, a concession won after intense political struggle, producing about 1,200 commissioned officers who will lead black troops. These officers face impossible situations, expected to succeed with inadequate training, inadequate supplies, and white superior officers who often undermine them at every turn. The 92nd and 93rd Divisions are the two black combat divisions, and their experiences will differ dramatically based on who commands them and how they're used. The camps in the South are particularly brutal, though camps everywhere present challenges. Houston in 1917 shows what can happen when the tension breaks. Black soldiers of the 24th Infantry, subjected to constant harassment by white civilians and police, finally snap after a series of provocations. A soldier is beaten by police. A rumor spreads that he's been killed, and over 100 black soldiers march into Houston with rifles. The night ends with dead on both sides, and the aftermath is swift and terrible. 13 black soldiers are hanged after the largest murder trial in American history, conducted with minimal due process. The executions carried out before appeals can be filed. More are sentenced to life in prison. The message is clear. Black soldiers will be punished for responding to violence with violence, for failing to accept whatever treatment white America decides to give them. The Houston Mutiny haunts black soldiers throughout the war, a reminder of what happens when you forget your place, a burden of collective punishment that follows you even to France. Now imagine yourself shipped across the Atlantic, packed into a transport with thousands of other soldiers, the submarine threat constant, the destination uncertain. You've never been to Europe. Most Americans haven't. The ocean crossing takes about 2 weeks, and you spend it wondering what's waiting on the other side. The seasickness is brutal for some, the cramped quarters uncomfortable for everyone, the excitement and fear mixing into something that keeps you awake at night. When France finally appears on the horizon, you feel something you didn't expect, hope. Because France isn't America. France doesn't have Jim Crow. France has been fighting alongside African colonial troops for years and has developed, if not perfect equality, at least a functional tolerance that will seem like paradise compared to what you left behind. The French don't flinch when they see you. They don't cross the street to avoid you. They treat you like a soldier, like a man, like a human being. It's disorienting at first, this absence of constant degradation. And then it's intoxicating. But the American military follows you across the ocean, bringing its racism along like luggage. The infamous secret information concerning Black American troops memo, issued by the American military to French commanders, asks the French to treat black soldiers the way white Americans do. Don't shake their hands. Don't eat with them. Don't praise them too highly. Don't let French women interact with them socially. The memo is an attempt to export Jim Crow, to prevent black soldiers from experiencing equality that might make them uppity when they return home. Some French commanders ignore it, others comply. The result is a patchwork of experiences, dignity in some places, and humiliation in others. The randomness of racism making each day uncertain. You never know when you'll be treated as a soldier, or when you'll be reminded that your country considers you less than human. Let's get you to the front, because that's where the real story happens. The trenches of the Western Front are unlike anything you've imagined, unlike anything anyone could imagine without seeing them. The war has been stalemated for years. Both sides dug into positions that stretch from Switzerland to the English Channel, neither able to advance more than a few miles before being thrown back. The technology of killing has outpaced the tactics of warfare, and the result is slaughter on an industrial scale. Machine guns mow down attacking infantry. Artillery shells tear bodies apart and bury them in the same motion. Poison gas drifts across no man's land, burning lungs and blinding eyes. The trenches themselves are attempts to survive this killing. Holes in the earth where men crouch below the level of machine gun fire, waiting for orders that might send them over the top into the meat grinder. You arrive at the front and descend into a trench for the first time. The smell hits you before anything else, a stench so thick you can taste it. Mud and blood and rotting flesh and human waste and the chemical tang of explosives, all blended into something that will live in your nostrils forever. The trench is narrower than you expected, barely wide enough for two men to pass, the walls reinforced with sandbags and wooden planks that are already rotting in the constant moisture. The floor is mud, not firm ground. Mud that sucks at your boots and never fully releases them. Mud that can swallow a man to his waist if he steps in the wrong place. Water seeps in from everywhere, pooling in the bottom of the trench, mixing with whatever else is down there. Your feet will be wet for weeks at a time, the skin softening and rotting, a condition called trench foot that can lead to gangrene and amputation if you're not careful. You learn to change your socks whenever possible, to rub whale oil into your feet, to do whatever you can to keep the rot at bay. The rats are everywhere. They're not shy like rats back home, scurrying away when humans appear. These rats are fat and bold, grown huge, on a diet you don't want to think about too carefully. They run across your body while you sleep, or try to sleep, their claws scratching through your uniform, their teeth gnawing at anything edible. Some men wake up with rats chewing on their hair, their ears, their fingers. Killing them is pointless because there are always more, an endless supply emerging from the churned earth where the bodies are buried, or not buried, just absorbed into the mud. The lice are almost worse because you can't escape them. They live in the seams of your uniform, in your hair, in every fold of skin, biting constantly, spreading disease, driving men to the edge of sanity with the endless itching. You learn to run a candle flame along the seams of your clothes, popping the lice with tiny sounds like distant gunfire. But they always come back. The daily routine of trench life is monotonous until it's terrifying. You rotate between frontline trenches, support trenches, and rest areas behind the lines, a few days in each before moving to the next. The rotation is supposed to give men a break from the worst of it, to prevent the complete psychological collapse that comes from too much time at the sharp end. But rest is relative. Even in the support trenches, shells can reach you. Even in the rest areas you work, repairing equipment, training, preparing for the next rotation forward. The frontline duty is the most dangerous, where you're closest to the enemy, where a sniper's bullet or a random shell can end you at any moment. You learn to keep your head down, literally, to never expose yourself above the parapet during daylight, to move through the trenches in a perpetual crouch that makes your back ache constantly. The trench system is more complex than you expected. Not just one ditch, but a whole network of them. The front line trench faces the enemy, with firing steps where you stand to shoot, and deeper sections where you shelter from bombardment. Behind that are communication trenches, zigzagging paths that connect the front to the rear, designed with sharp angles, so that if the enemy gets into one section, they can't fire straight down the length. Support trenches hold reserve troops ready to reinforce or counterattack. The whole system is like a maze, and getting lost is easy, especially at night, especially under fire. You learn the routes by heart because your life depends on knowing exactly where to go when everything goes wrong. At night, patrols go out into no man's land, that blasted landscape between the lines where nothing lives and death waits in shell craters. You crawl through mud and barbed wire, trying to gather intelligence about enemy positions, trying to capture prisoners for interrogation, trying to repair your own wire, trying to survive until you can crawl back. The darkness is both protection and danger, hiding you from enemy eyes, but also hiding the threats you're crawling toward. Some patrols don't come back. You hear them sometimes, wounded men calling for help in the darkness, calling until they stop calling, and you can't go to them because going to them means dying too. The sounds stay with you. Join the other sounds that replay in your mind when you try to sleep. Become part of the permanent background noise of trauma that every combat soldier carries. Stand to happens twice a day, at dawn and dusk, the times when attacks are most likely. Every man in the trench climbs to the firing step, rifle ready, eyes scanning the enemy line for any sign of movement. You stand there for an hour, sometimes longer, watching and waiting for an attack that usually doesn't come. The tension is exhausting, the constant readiness wearing you down, even when nothing happens. After stand-to comes breakfast if you're lucky, hot food brought up from the rear, tea and bacon and bread if the supply lines are working, cold bully beef and hardtack if they're not. You eat quickly, never knowing when the shelling might start, never able to fully relax even during meals. The artillery is the constant companion, the background noise of trench warfare that you learn to read like weather. The whistle of incoming shells, the pitch telling you whether to duck or run. The crash of explosions that shake the earth and shower you with dirt and debris. The silence afterward that's somehow worse because you're waiting for the next one. Barrages can last for hours, days even. The enemy trying to destroy your trenches before their infantry advances, trying to kill enough of you that the survivors can't resist. You huddle in dugouts carved into the trench walls, listening to the world being torn apart above you, praying that the next shell doesn't find the entrance, doesn't collapse the ceiling, doesn't bury you alive in French soil thousands of miles from home. Men break under the bombardment. They start screaming and can't stop. They run into the open, preferring quick death to the slow agony of waiting. Shell shock, they call it. And it's treated as cowardice by some officers, as if the mind can withstand infinite trauma without cracking. Now here's where your experience as a black soldier becomes different from what white soldiers face, where the particular burden of your skin meets the universal burden of combat. The 93rd Division, which includes the famous 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, is assigned to fight under French command. This happens because American commanders don't want black soldiers in their ranks, don't trust them, don't believe they can fight, and are happy to hand them off to the French, who are desperate for reinforcements after 4 years of bleeding. It's a rejection, an insult, a statement that you're not good enough for the American army even though you wear its uniform. It turns out to be a blessing disguised as rejection. The French treat you as soldiers, plain and simple. They don't care about the theories of racial inferiority that American officers believe. They've been fighting alongside African colonial troops since the war began. Senegalese and Moroccan and Algerian soldiers who have proven themselves in combat countless times. They know that courage has no color. They give you French weapons because there aren't enough American weapons, and because French ammunition is what the supply lines deliver. You trade your American Enfield rifle for a French Liebel, your campaign hat for a blue Adrian helmet. You learn French military terminology, French tactics, French ways of doing things. You eat French rations, drink French wine, learn French curses to shout when the shells come down. The integration isn't perfect. The French have their own racial attitudes, their own colonial hierarchies, their own assumptions about the African troops in their ranks. But it's so much better than what you left behind that it feels like liberation. French officers address you with respect. French civilians welcome you into their homes, their cafes, their lives. You discover what it feels like to walk down a street without calculating threat, to enter an establishment without wondering if you'll be served, to exist in public without the constant low-grade terror that American life requires. Some soldiers fall in love with French women, relationships that would be illegal in many American states, and the women don't seem to care about the laws of a country they've never seen. The Harlem Hellfighters earn their nickname the hard way. They spend 191 days in combat, longer than any other American unit in the war, and they will never lose a foot of ground to the enemy, never have a man captured despite intense fighting. They hold positions when ordered to hold, attack when ordered to attack, endure bombardments and gas attacks and raids with a determination that silences anyone who questioned their courage. The entire regiment will be awarded the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor, a recognition that the American military never provides. Individual soldiers collect medals for specific acts of bravery, their heroism documented and celebrated by a nation that isn't theirs. Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts become the first Americans of any color to receive the Croix de Guerre individually, and their story shows what black soldiers were capable of when given the chance. They're on sentry duty in May 1918 when a German raiding party hits their position. There are at least 24 Germans, maybe more, against 2 men. Roberts is wounded early, unable to stand, but he hands grenades to Johnson, who throws them into the attackers. When the rifle jams, Johnson uses it as a club. When that breaks, he pulls his bolo knife and wades into the Germans, slashing and stabbing, taking wounds but keeping fighting. The Germans are trying to drag Roberts away as a prisoner, and Johnson isn't going to let that happen. He kills at least 4 Germans and wounds many more, fighting until the raiders retreat, fighting until reinforcements arrive to find him standing over Roberts, covered in blood, most of it not his own. Johnson becomes a hero in France, his face on postcards, his story told in newspapers, a symbol of American valor at a time when America needs symbols. When he returns home, he'll be forgotten, denied the Medal of Honor he deserves, denied disability benefits despite injuries that leave him unable to work, and will die in poverty in 1929. The Army won't acknowledge his heroism with the Medal of Honor until 2015, almost a century too late. The 92nd Division has a harder time. Kept under American command, they're saddled with white officers, many from the South, who don't believe black soldiers can fight and treat them accordingly. The division is poorly trained, poorly supplied, poorly led. When they're finally committed to combat in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest American operation of the war, some units perform well while others struggle. The failures are blamed on black cowardice and incompetence rather than on the systemic neglect that caused them. Reports are written that condemn black soldiers as unreliable, that use the 90 seconds difficulties to argue against ever using black combat troops again. The reports ignore the units that fought bravely, ignore the officers who failed their men, ignore everything that doesn't fit the predetermined conclusion. These reports will shape military policy for decades, will be cited to justify continued segregation, will erase the sacrifices of men who deserved better. Let's talk about what you're actually fighting for, beyond the grand rhetoric about democracy. You're fighting for the man next to you, same as soldiers in every war. The bonds formed in trenches transcend race in ways that would be impossible back home, at least within your own unit. You share food, share cigarettes, share body heat on cold nights, share the trauma of watching friends die. The soldier who pulls you into a shell crater when the shelling starts doesn't care about your color. The soldier you drag back to the trench after he's wounded doesn't care either. Combat creates intimacy that peacetime never allows, a closeness born of mutual dependence that makes the racism waiting back home seem even more absurd. You're good enough to die next to, but not good enough to drink next to. You're trusted with a rifle in France, but will be lynched for asserting yourself in Georgia. The contradiction burns, and you carry that burning with you into every assault, every patrol, every moment of terror and courage. The gas attacks are particular nightmares. Poison gas was supposed to break the stalemate, a weapon so horrible it would force the enemy to surrender or die. Instead, both sides use it, and it becomes another feature of the landscape, another way to die or wish you had. When the alarm goes up, you have seconds to get your mask on, to seal it against your face, to trust that the rubber and charcoal will filter out whatever the Germans have sent this time. Chlorine burns the lungs, fills them with fluid until you drown in your own body. Phosgene is worse, delayed effects that seem mild at first and then kill you a day later. Mustard gas blisters the skin, blinds the eyes, destroys the lungs over agonizing weeks. You've seen men who breathe too much, their skin peeling, their eyes swollen shut, their lungs rattling with every breath. You've helped carry them to aid stations knowing they won't survive. The masks are hot and claustrophobic, the lenses fogging with your breath, the filter making each inhale a labor. You fight in masks sometimes, unable to see clearly, unable to hear commands, stumbling through toxic fog toward an enemy you can barely perceive. Going over the top is the moment everything else leads to. The whistle blows, and you climb out of the relative safety of the trench into the open killing ground. Your legs are heavy, your heart pounding, your mind screaming at you to get back down. But you go forward because everyone is going forward. Because stopping means letting down the men beside you. Because death is waiting either way. And at least this death moves towards something. The machine guns open up almost immediately. That stuttering roar that means men are falling. That the mathematics of modern warfare are being calculated in blood. You run, or try to run, through mud that grabs at your feet, through craters that swallow you to the waist, through barbed wire that tears at your uniform and your flesh. Men drop around you, some silently, some screaming, some just sitting down as if tired, and then not getting up. You don't stop to help because stopping means dying, because the only way out is through, because the aid station is behind you and the objective is ahead. The moments after a successful assault are strange and quiet. You've taken the enemy trench, or what's left of it, and now you're standing in their filth instead of yours. German bodies lie where they fell, some still moving, some already still. The smell is different here, the same bass notes of death and decay, but with unfamiliar tobacco and unfamiliar food mixed in. Prisoners emerge with hands raised, terrified boys who look just like the terrified boys in your unit, their Feldgrau uniforms muddy and torn, their eyes asking if you're going to kill them. You don't, usually. The rules say prisoners are valuable, that they know things the intelligence officers want to know. You send them back toward your lines, and then you start fortifying, because the Germans will counterattack, and you need to be ready. You pile sandbags, string wire, set up machine guns facing the other way. The trench you just captured becomes your trench, and you'll defend it with the same desperation you just used to take it. War is a machine that consumes space and lives without producing anything but more war. The wounded are everywhere after an assault, moaning in shell holes, dragging themselves toward aid stations, lying still where they fell. The stretcher bearers work through the chaos. Brave men who go into fire without weapons to bring back those who might be saved. Being a stretcher bearer is one of the most dangerous jobs in the war, and black soldiers serve as stretcher bearers throughout the conflict, carrying white and black wounded alike, because in the aid stations, at least, blood is blood. The aid stations themselves are overwhelmed during major operations, surgeons working for days without rest, amputating limbs and probing for shrapnel by the light of oil lamps. The wounds are horrific, the weapons of modern war designed to tear and shatter, to create injuries that earlier medicine couldn't have addressed. Men survive things that would have killed them in any previous war, saved by antiseptics and blood transfusions and surgical techniques developed specifically for this slaughter. If you're wounded badly enough, you're evacuated to hospitals further back, moving through a chain of medical facilities until you reach somewhere safe enough for recovery. The hospitals are segregated, of course, black soldiers treated in separate wards by separate staff, the Jim Crow following you even when you're bleeding. But the French hospitals don't segregate, and some black soldiers find themselves receiving care alongside white patients, a novelty that feels normal after the abnormality of American arrangements. Recovery can take weeks or months, and then you're either sent back to your unit, or, if the wounds are too severe, discharged and sent home. The men sent home often struggle, their injuries making work difficult, the military benefits they're entitled to denied or delayed, the gratitude of a nation conspicuously absent. The winter in the trenches is a special kind of suffering. The mud freezes and then thaws, cycling between hard and soft, in ways that make everything worse. Your uniform is never dry, never warm, never adequate against the cold that seeps into everything. Your fingers go numb, making it hard to work your rifle, hard to button your coat, hard to do anything that requires fine motor control. Frostbite claims toes and fingers, ears and noses, the flesh dying in the cold and turning black. You stamp your feet constantly, trying to keep the blood flowing, trying to convince yourself that the tingling hasn't turned to numbness. At night, you huddle with others for warmth. Body heat, the only reliable source. Personal space, a luxury you can't afford. The hot food that's supposed to come up from the rear arrives cold, more often than not. The carrying parties unable to move fast enough. The food losing heat with every step. You eat it anyway because cold food is better than no food, because your body needs fuel to generate warmth, because refusing to eat is refusing to survive. The letters from home are lifelines and reminders. Your family writes about normal things, about crops and weather and neighborhood gossip, about a world that seems impossibly distant from where you are. They don't know what the trenches are really like because you don't tell them, because putting it into words seems impossible, because you don't want to worry them any more than they already do. Sometimes letters bring news you don't want. A lynching back home, a relative arrested for some invented offense, the reminder that the country you're fighting for is still at war with your people. The contrast is maddening. Here in France, you're treated with something approaching respect. At home, your family can't ride in the front of a streetcar. Here, you're trusted with weapons and responsibility. At home, voting is a risk that can get you killed. You fight harder because of it, or maybe despite it, channeling the anger into something useful, proving with every battle that black men can soldier as well as anyone. The war ends in November 1918, an armistice that stops the killing with sudden abruptness. One moment the guns are firing, the next moment silence falls along the entire Western Front, a silence so profound it seems supernatural after years of constant noise. You stand in your trench, rifle still in hand, waiting for something that doesn't come. Men emerge cautiously, not quite believing it's over, half expecting the shooting to start again. When it doesn't, when the minutes stretch into hours and the hours into days, something releases in your chest that you didn't know was clenched. You survived. Somehow, against all the odds and all the ways there were to die, you survived. The celebrations are muted at first, exhaustion dampening everything, and then they build into something like joy. You drink whatever's available, sing songs in languages you've learned from your French comrades, embrace men who were strangers a year ago and are now closer than brothers. The return home brings its own battles, a different kind of warfare that you're even less prepared for than the trenches. You march through French streets, and French crowds cheer, throw flowers, call you heroes. The women who were supposed to avoid you, according to that memo, instead kiss your cheeks and shake your hands, tell you mercy with tears in their eyes. You're honored with medals and parades, your sacrifices acknowledged by a nation that isn't yours, but that has treated you better than the nation that is. The French don't want you to leave. Some soldiers don't, staying behind to build lives in a country where they can breathe, where they can walk into any restaurant and be served, where they can love who they love without fear of the rope. But most of you board the ships home, carrying souvenirs and memories and wounds both visible and invisible. With every mile westward, you feel the walls closing in again. The ships themselves are segregated, black soldiers in separate quarters, eating at separate times, reminded before you even reach American waters that the equality you tasted in France was borrowed, temporary, not meant for you to keep. The debarkation camps are segregated, black units processed separately, the efficiency of military logistics maintaining the inefficiency of racism. The trains home are segregated, and if you're heading south, you learn to move to the Jim Crow car before you cross the Mason-Dixon line, to shed the dignity you earned in France before it gets you killed in Georgia. Some men refuse, and some of those men don't make it home alive, murdered for the crime of believing that service to their country entitled them to respect. The parades, where they happen at all, are segregated, black soldiers marching separately or not marching at all. White America doesn't want to see black men in uniform, doesn't want to acknowledge that black men fought and died and proved themselves. The sight is too dangerous, too likely to give other black people ideas, too likely to undermine the whole structure of white supremacy that depends on black inferiority. The Harlem Hellfighters get their parade up Fifth Avenue, a proud march through the neighborhood that sent them off. Thousands of people lining the streets to welcome them home. The regimental band plays, the same band that introduced jazz to France and will help define American music for the century to come. It's a glorious day, a moment of recognition and pride, but it's an exception. Most black veterans come home quietly, told to forget what they experienced in France, warned not to expect anything to change, advised to resume their place at the bottom of American society, as if the war never happened. The Red Summer of 1919 makes the warning explicit and bloody. Across America, in more than 24 cities and towns, white mobs attack black communities with a ferocity that exceeds anything since Reconstruction. The violence targets veterans specifically, punishing them for wearing uniforms, for having ideas above their station, for thinking that fighting for democracy meant they deserved some. In Chicago, a black teenager swimming in Lake Michigan drifts across an invisible line into white water and is stoned until he drowns. The police do nothing, and when black people protest, the city explodes into days of rioting that leave dozens dead and hundreds homeless. In Washington, white sailors and soldiers, many just back from France themselves, roam through black neighborhoods attacking anyone they find, until black veterans organize and fight back, turning the nation's capital into a battleground. In Elaine, Arkansas, black sharecroppers who try to organize for better treatment are massacred. Hundreds killed according to some estimates. The true number never known because no one bothered to count black bodies. In cities and towns across the country, the pattern repeats: white violence, black resistance, official indifference or active support for the attackers. Some veterans fight back using skills learned in France, organizing community defense, refusing to be victims. The fighting terrifies white America, which expected submission and got resistance, which thought the war would teach black men their place and found instead that it taught them their worth. The backlash is severe. More lynchings, more restrictions, more determined efforts to push black Americans back into the subordination they had briefly escaped. But something had changed that couldn't be unchanged. The men who served in France had seen another possibility, had lived in a world where their skin didn't automatically mark them as inferior, had proven to themselves and to anyone watching that they could do anything white soldiers could do. That knowledge couldn't be unlearned. It fueled the new Negro movement, the cultural explosion of the Harlem Renaissance, the early stirrings of the civil rights movement that would eventually transform America. The veterans returned to their communities with new confidence, new expectations, new determination to claim what they had earned. The country wasn't ready to give it to them. Not yet, but the struggle had begun, and it would continue until it couldn't be ignored any longer. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about what those men endured. The trenches that were misery for everyone, the extra burden they carried because of who they were. Think about Henry Johnson fighting off a German raid with a knife and his fists, saving his friend, becoming a hero who would die forgotten. Think about the Harlem Hellfighters spending 191 days under fire, never retreating, never surrendering. Think about the men who went over the top knowing they might not come back, fighting for a country that wouldn't fight for them, believing that courage might eventually earn them justice. The trenches of France were hell, but they were also proving grounds, places where black soldiers demonstrated beyond any doubt that they belonged, that they were capable, that the lies told about them were lies. That proof didn't change America overnight, but it planted seeds that would eventually flower, would inspire generations who came after, would contribute to a long, slow movement toward the equality that those soldiers deserved and never received. Let their sacrifice carry you into peaceful sleep, and remember that the fight they started continues still. Let's start with how you ended up in this situation, because understanding convict leasing requires understanding how the system created convicts out of free people. The Civil War ended slavery, but it didn't end the need for cheap labor, especially in the South, where the entire economy had been built on forced work. The plantation owners, the industrialists, the men who ran the mines and built the railroads, they needed bodies to do the work, and they weren't willing to pay fair wages to get them. So they found another way. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as punishment for crime. That exception became a loophole large enough to swallow hundreds of thousands of black lives. The Black Codes came first, laws passed across the South immediately after the war that criminalized ordinary behavior when black people did it. Vagrancy laws made it a crime to be unemployed, which meant any black man without a white employer vouching for him could be arrested. The definition of vagrancy was flexible enough to catch almost anyone. Walking on railroad tracks, speaking too loudly, being out after dark, not having proof of employment, looking suspicious to a white person who felt like calling the sheriff. If you couldn't prove you had a job, you were a vagrant. If you left a job without permission, you were a vagrant. If you were between jobs, you were a vagrant. The law was designed to catch you no matter what you did. Other laws targeted behaviors that weren't crimes at all when white people did them. Gambling was illegal, but only enforced in black communities. Changing employers without permission became a criminal offense. Speaking disrespectfully to a white person could get you arrested. Being present at a place where a crime allegedly occurred made you an accomplice. The creativity was almost impressive, if it weren't so evil. They invented crimes specifically to arrest black people, and then they leased those prisoners to private companies who needed workers. The arrest was the first step in a process designed to turn free people into slaves by another name. The courts were part of the machinery, not a check on it. Judges were elected by white voters who wanted black labor controlled. Sheriffs earned fees for each arrest, which meant they had financial incentives to arrest as many people as possible. Lawyers cost money that most black defendants didn't have, so they faced trial without representation. Juries were all white because black people couldn't serve. The trials themselves were formalities, lasting minutes, the verdict predetermined, the sentence whatever the labor market demanded. If the mines needed workers, sentences got longer. If the railroads were behind schedule, more people got arrested. The justice system wasn't just compromised by racism. It was operated as a labor recruitment mechanism, kidnapping people under color of law. Now imagine you're one of the arrested. You are walking down a road in rural Alabama, maybe heading to visit family, maybe looking for work, maybe just existing as a black man in a place where existing was enough to make you suspicious. A deputy stops you, asks for your papers, asks where you're going, asks questions designed to trap you no matter how you answer. You don't have documentation because you've never needed it before, because freedom was supposed to mean not needing a pass to walk down a public road. But that's not how it works anymore. You're arrested for vagrancy, hauled before a judge the next morning, convicted in a proceeding that lasts less than 5 minutes, and sentenced to a term that might be months or might be years. The sentence isn't really about the alleged crime. It's about how much labor someone is willing to pay for. The leasing happens fast. The state doesn't want to house prisoners, doesn't want to feed them, doesn't want to spend any money on people it considers worthless. Private companies bid for the right to lease convicts, paying the state a fee per prisoner per day. The highest bidder wins, and you become their property for the duration of your sentence. The mining companies are the hungriest buyers, always needing more workers for the dangerous, deadly work of extracting coal from Alabama's hills. Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, Pratt Coal and Coke Company, Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron Company. These corporate names become synonymous with suffering. They pay the state, and the state delivers you to the mines. And what happens after that is nobody's concern except the company that now owns your labor. You're transported to the mining camp in chains, along with dozens of other men who've been swept up by the same system. Some of them are actual criminals, men who committed real offenses, but many are like you, arrested for nothing, convicted of existing. The camp appears through the trees, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by fences, guards with rifles watching from towers. It looks like a prison, because it is a prison, a private prison operated for profit, where the only measure of success is how much coal comes out of the ground and how little it costs to extract. You're marched to the processing area, stripped of your clothes, given a uniform that's already stiff with the sweat and blood of previous wearers, assigned a number that will be your identity for as long as you survive. The mine itself is a hole in the earth, a shaft descending into darkness, into heat, into an underworld that will become your entire existence. The coal seams in Alabama run deep, and the companies have been chasing them for years, tunneling further and further from the surface, creating labyrinths that stretch for miles underground. The entrance is a rectangle of darkness set into the hillside, tracks running into it for the coal cars, a steady stream of men going in and coming out, though not always the same men. The smell hits you before you enter, a mixture of coal dust, sweat, mule dung, and something else, something you'll later recognize as fear. The men around you move with the shuffling gait of exhaustion, their faces black with coal dust, their eyes showing white, their bodies already broken by work that will eventually break you too. You descend into the mine for the first time, and the darkness swallows you. The shafts are lit by oil lamps that create pools of flickering light surrounded by absolute blackness. The walls press in, the ceiling sometimes so low you have to crawl, the air thick with dust that coats your lungs with every breath. The temperature rises as you go deeper, the earth's heat combining with the body heat of dozens of men working in confined spaces, until the sweat pours off you constantly, soaking. Clothes that never dry, creating conditions perfect for the skin diseases that will eventually cover your body. The noise is constant, picks striking rock, coal cars rattling on tracks, men shouting, mules braying, the earth itself groaning as tunnels are cut deeper into its body. Your job is to dig coal, to swing a pick for hours without stopping, to fill cars that will be hauled to the surface while you stay below, always below. The coal seam might be 3 feet thick, or it might be 6 inches, and when it's 6 inches, you work lying on your side, swinging the pick in an arc that barely clears your own body, the rock pressing down on you from above, the coal dust filling your mouth and nose with every breath. The work is done by lamplight, the small flame on your cap the only illumination, casting shadows that make the tunnel walls seem to move, that hide the dangers until they're on top of you. The quota is set by the company, and it's set high, higher than any reasonable person could meet consistently, but meeting it is mandatory. Each man is expected to mine a certain tonnage each day, and the cars are weighed when they reach the surface. Fall short and you're punished. Meet the quota, and you're expected to exceed it tomorrow. The system is designed so that you're always behind, always in debt to the company, always one bad day away from the whip. Some men manage to meet quota by working every possible minute, by skipping meals, by pushing their bodies past every limit. Others form informal partnerships, helping each other fill cars, covering for men who are sick or injured, trying to protect the group from punishment that falls on individuals. The guards carry leather straps, wooden paddles, whatever implements of pain the camp boss prefers, and they use them liberally, not just for punishment, but for motivation, for entertainment, for the simple exercise of power over men who can't fight back. The whippings happen in front of everyone, the victim stripped and held down while the blows fall, the sound of leather on flesh echoing through the camp, the screams serving as warnings to everyone watching. A man might receive 20 lashes, 50 lashes, 100 lashes, the number depending on the offense and the mood of the guard administering the punishment. Some men die from whippings, their bodies unable to withstand the trauma, the skin flayed from their backs, the shock stopping their hearts. Their deaths are recorded as due to other causes or not recorded at all, the truth buried along with their bodies. The mines themselves are death traps in ways that go beyond the intentional cruelty. Coal mining is inherently dangerous, but the convict mines were worse than any free labor operation would have been allowed to be. Safety measures cost money, and the companies had no incentive to spend money protecting workers who could be replaced for the cost of another lease payment. Ventilation was inadequate, allowing methane gas to accumulate in the tunnels, creating conditions for explosions that could kill dozens at once. The Pratt Mines disaster of 1888 killed over 100 men when gas ignited deep underground, the explosion so powerful it blew bodies out of the mine entrance. So hot it fused coal and rock and flesh into indistinguishable masses. Roof supports were minimal, the timbers too few and too weak, the rock above groaning and cracking until it came down on the men below. The explosions were spectacular tragedies that occasionally made the newspapers, but the daily accidents killed more men over time. Cave-ins buried workers under tons of rock, sometimes killing them instantly, sometimes trapping them alive to suffocate slowly, while rescuers tried to dig through. Coal cars broke loose and rolled down inclines, crushing anyone in their path. Tools slipped and struck flesh. Men fell down shafts that descended hundreds of feet. The mules that hauled coal cars through the tunnels kicked and bit, injuring handlers who couldn't get out of the way in the cramped passages. Every day brought new injuries, new deaths, new reminders that the mine would take you eventually, that the only question was when and how. The hours are inhuman. You enter the mine before dawn and emerge after dark, spending your entire waking life underground, except for the brief periods of eating and sleeping. 14 hours, 16 hours, sometimes more during busy seasons when the company needs extra production. There are no days off, no weekends, no holidays. Sunday might bring a few extra hours of rest, or it might not, depending on the whims of the management and the demands of the market. Christmas and New Year's pass like any other days, marked only by the guard's mood, which might be slightly better or slightly worse than usual. You work until you can't work anymore, and then you're punished until you work again, and the cycle continues until your sentence ends or your body gives out. For many men, the body gives out first. The food is barely enough to sustain life, certainly not enough to sustain the brutal labor demanded. Cornmeal and fatback, day after day, the same meal morning and night, supplemented occasionally with beans or vegetables if the camp is well supplied. More often just the cornmeal mush and the rancid pork fat that provides the only calories the company is willing to spend. The portions are calculated to keep you alive and working, nothing more. Every calorie a cost that cuts into profits. A mining company that fed its convict laborers well was a mining company that made less money, and the whole point of the system was to make money. Men grow thin despite the physical labor that should have built muscle. Their bodies consume themselves, burning fat and then muscle to fuel work that demands more than the food provides. The hunger becomes a constant companion, a gnawing in your belly that never fully goes away, that wakes you at night, that makes you dream of food you'll never eat, that makes you think about food constantly, even when you should be thinking about the rock above your head that might come down at any moment. Some men steal from each other, desperate enough to risk the punishment that comes with getting caught. Some men catch rats and roaches, eating whatever they can find in the barracks, their bodies demanding fuel that the company won't provide. The guards don't care what you eat as long as you keep working. They don't care if you're starving as long as you can still swing a pick. The water situation is almost as bad as the food. The camps have wells or streams that provide drinking water, but the water is often contaminated, shared by men and mules alike, carrying diseases that spread through the population in waves. Dysentery is endemic, men losing control of their bowels, losing fluid their bodies can't afford to lose, weakening to the point where work becomes impossible and death becomes likely. The latrines are pits dug behind the barracks, overwhelmed by the number of users, breeding grounds for the flies that spread illness, stinking so powerfully that the smell reaches everywhere, that you can never fully escape it, that it becomes part of the background of your existence like the coal dust and the fear. The sleeping quarters are wooden barracks, rows of bunks stacked 3 high. Men packed so tightly that turning over means bumping the person next to you, that the body heat of dozens becomes overwhelming on summer nights, that the cold of winter seeps through walls that were never built to keep anything out. The mattresses are straw ticks, thin and infested with vermin, the straw flattened by use, until you might as well be lying on the wooden slats beneath. The blankets are inadequate, thin wool that might keep you comfortable in mild weather, but that can't fight the Alabama winter when it turns serious. In summer, the barracks become ovens, the heat trapped inside, the smell of unwashed bodies, overwhelming, the air so thick it's hard to breathe. In winter, men freeze, huddling together for warmth, waking to find frost on the inside of the walls, breathing out clouds that hang in the air. The lice and bed bugs are constant, crawling across your skin as you try to sleep, biting and itching and spreading diseases that will eventually kill some of your fellow prisoners. You can feel them moving on you, can hear them in the straw, can see them when you shake out your clothes in the morning. There's no way to get rid of them, no bathing facilities adequate to the task, no clean clothes to change into, no escape from the infestation that covers every surface and every body in the camp. The itching drives men half mad, scratching until they bleed, creating open sores that become infected, adding one more misery to the pile that already seems unbearable. Sleep is something you steal in fragments, never enough, never restful. Your body crying out for rest that the schedule won't allow. The guards are not bound by any law you would recognize. They can beat you for any reason or no reason. They can shoot you if you try to escape, and sometimes they shoot you even if you don't. They can withhold food, can extend sentences, can make your life significantly worse than it already is. And there's no one to appeal to, no oversight, no accountability. Some guards are simply cruel, men who enjoy inflicting pain, who sort out this work because it lets them hurt people without consequences. Others are indifferent, doing a job, viewing the prisoners as less than human, treating you the way they might treat a stubborn mule. Neither type sees you as a person. You're a unit of production, a machine that converts food into coal, valuable only as long as you keep producing. The death rate in the Alabama mines was staggering, so high that it shocked even people who were used to industrial accidents, even people who thought black lives were cheap. In some years, nearly half, the convict miners died. Not were injured, died. The Banner mine in Jefferson County recorded death rates that approached 45% in its worst years. The Pratt mines, which would later become part of the US Steel Empire, killed convicts at rates that would have been scandalous if the victims had been anyone who mattered to the people in power. The causes of death were various, and the records, when they exist at all, often obscure the truth. Cave-ins that buried men alive, the rock coming down without warning, trapping workers under tons of debris that might take days to clear, by which time the trapped men had suffocated or bled to death or simply died of thirst, waiting for rescue that came too late. Explosions of coal gas that incinerated entire work crews, the methane accumulating in poorly ventilated tunnels until a spark from a pick or a lamp set off a fireball that traveled through the shafts at the speed of sound, burning everything in its path, leaving bodies charred beyond recognition. Falls down shafts, tumbles from unstable platforms, collisions with coal cars, injuries from the mules that dragged equipment through the tunnels, the 1,000 ways that a dangerous environment could kill men who were already weakened by hunger and exhaustion. The diseases killed even more than the accidents. Tuberculosis was endemic, the coal dust shredding lungs with every breath, creating lesions where the bacteria could take hold. The cramped sleeping quarters ensuring that the disease spread from man to man until nearly everyone was infected. The TB came on slowly, a cough that got worse, a weakness that didn't go away, a fever that spiked and fell and spiked again, until finally you were coughing blood and couldn't work and were left to die in the camp hospital or wherever you happened to collapse. Pneumonia killed men weakened by overwork and underfeeding, their bodies unable to fight infections that healthy men might survive. Dysentery swept through, camps where sanitation was non-existent, dehydrating men to the point of death. Typhoid came with contaminated water. Smallpox came in waves. Every disease that preys on weakened immune systems found its way into the convict camps. And then there were the deaths that weren't accidents at all. The men who were beaten to death by guards who went too far. The men shot while allegedly escaping. The men worked until their hearts gave out. The men who simply disappeared from the records without explanation. The companies had no obligation to account for their workers the way they would have had to account for free employees. A dead convict was a financial inconvenience, a lease payment that had been wasted, but it wasn't a crime, wasn't an investigation, wasn't anything that required explanation. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves near the camps, often in the same mass trenches, often without any notification to families who didn't know where their relatives had been taken in the first place. The company doctors, when they existed at all, were there to get men back to work, not to heal them. A man who couldn't work was useless, a cost without a return. So the goal was always to return prisoners to the mines as quickly as possible, regardless of their actual condition. The doctor's examination was brief and brutal. Can you walk? Can you hold a pick? Can you produce coal? If the answers were yes, you went back to work. If the answers were no, you might get a day or two in the hospital ward, a cot in a room full of other broken men, before you were sent back anyway or left to die. Injuries that should have meant weeks of rest were treated with a day or two off before the man was sent back underground. Broken bones were splintered crudely and declared healed long before they actually were. Infected wounds were bandaged and ignored until the infection spread, until gangrene set in, until amputation became the only option. Diseases were treated with whatever patent, medicines the company had bought cheap, nostrums that did nothing, that might actually make things worse, that were given out to create the appearance of medical care without the expense of actual treatment. Men worked with broken bones, with infected wounds, with fevers that should have kept them in bed, with conditions that were slowly killing them, because the alternative was punishment that might kill them faster. Some doctors were simply incompetent, men who couldn't find work in legitimate medical practice, who took jobs in the convict camps because no one else would have them. Others were competent but constrained, understanding what their patients needed but unable to provide it, knowing that the company wouldn't pay for real treatment, that advocating too strongly for prisoners' health would get them fired. A few were actively cruel, seeing the prisoners as less than human, experimenting with treatments, withholding care as punishment, participating in the system's cruelty rather than just tolerating it. The doctor's job was to determine whether you could still swing a pick, and if you could, you went back to the mine. If you couldn't, you might be sent back anyway. Your life was worth less than the coal you could produce. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical suffering. You had been a free man, with a name, a family, a life. Now you were a number, a commodity, a tool to be used until you broke. The humiliation was constant, the guards addressing you with slurs, the work stripping away every dignity, the conditions reducing you to an animal struggling to survive. Men lost hope, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing to lose, because hope was what kept you putting one foot in front of the other. Some men tried to escape, knowing the odds were against them, preferring the risk of being shot to the certainty of being worked to death. Most were caught and brought back, punished savagely, their sentences extended. A few made it, disappearing into the woods, making their way north, carrying stories that the rest of the country didn't want to hear. Some men chose death deliberately, a final act of agency in a world that had stripped them of all other choices. They walked into danger in the mines, or they attacked guards knowing they would be killed, or they simply stopped eating and let their bodies fade. The will to live can only sustain so much, and the camps tested that limit daily. The men who survived did so through luck as much as determination, through random chance that put them in the safer parts of the mine, that kept them out of the worst guard's sight, that spared them from the epidemics that killed their bunkmates. Survival wasn't something you earned through effort. It was something that happened to you, or didn't. The companies that ran these operations were not shadowy figures. They were pillars of Southern industry. Their executives respected members of society, their stockholders including some of the most prominent names in American business. Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, was eventually bought by U.S. Steel, making one of the largest corporations in America complicit in the system. The profits generated by convict labor funded the industrialization of the South, built fortunes that still exist today, created the infrastructure that modern Alabama still uses. The coal that came out of those mines powered factories and heated homes across the country. The steel made from Alabama iron built bridges and buildings. The entire Southern industrial economy was subsidized by this system of neo-slavery, the costs externalized onto black bodies that nobody was counting. The leasing companies preferred black convicts, and the statistics show it clearly. While black people were a minority of Alabama's population, they were the vast majority of its convict laborers. The system wasn't colorblind. It was designed to catch black people specifically, to recreate the labor, arrangements of slavery under a new legal framework. White convicts existed, but they were often given different, less dangerous work, or they served shorter sentences, or they were leased to farms rather than mines. The mines were for black men, because black lives were cheaper, because black deaths didn't generate the kind of attention that white deaths might, because the whole system depended on a supply of laborers who could be used up and replaced without consequence. The families of convict laborers suffered terribly, often not knowing where their husbands or sons or brothers had been taken, often not learning of their deaths until months later, if at all. A man could be arrested in one county, tried in another, and shipped to a mine in a third, all without anyone notifying his family. The arrest itself might happen without witnesses, a man taken while walking alone, his family learning only when he failed to come home, searching for days or weeks before discovering that he was in custody, if they ever discovered it at all. Women showed up at jails looking for missing relatives, only to be told they had been leased out, with no information about where or for how long. The clerks who processed the paperwork didn't keep track of such details, or didn't care to share them, or actively enjoyed the suffering of families desperate for information. A wife might travel to 3 different counties looking for her husband, spending money she couldn't afford, only to learn that he had been sent to a mine she'd never heard of in a part of the state she'd never been to. By the time she found him, if she found him, he might already be dead. Children grew up without fathers, their families plunged into poverty by the loss of a breadwinner who had committed no real crime. The women left behind had to find ways to support themselves and their children in an economy that offered black women few options beyond domestic service, work that paid barely enough to survive, that required long hours away from home, that left children to raise themselves or be raised by neighbors and relatives. The economic devastation rippled outward from each arrest, affecting not just the man who was taken, but everyone who depended on him. The terror of the arrest extended beyond the man who was taken, spreading through communities, creating a constant fear that any black man might be next. Parents warned their sons to be careful, to avoid situations that might attract the attention of sheriffs looking for laborers, to never be caught alone, to never give anyone an excuse. But the excuses were so flimsy that avoiding them was impossible. You could be arrested for walking on a road. You could be arrested for sitting on a bench. You could be arrested for existing in a place where a white person wanted you removed. The fear was rational because the threat was real, and the fear itself was part of the system's function, keeping black communities afraid, keeping black workers compliant, making sure everyone understood who had power and who didn't. The reformers who tried to end convict leasing faced powerful opposition from every direction. The state government depended on the revenue the system generated, money that funded schools and roads and public services without requiring white taxpayers to pay higher taxes. Governors, who might have been sympathetic to reform, found themselves trapped by budgets that couldn't balance without the lease payments. Legislators who proposed changes found their bills killed in committee, their political careers threatened, their motives questioned. The system had become essential to the state's finances, and dismantling it would require finding new revenue sources that no one wanted to provide. The mining companies had political connections that protected their interests at every level of government. They contributed to campaigns, employed relatives of politicians, made themselves indispensable to the state's economic development. Their executives sat on boards with governors and senators, socialized with judges and prosecutors, belonged to the same churches and clubs as the men who made the laws. When journalists wrote exposés of the conditions in the camps, company representatives responded with denials and counterattacks, questioning the journalists' motives, dismissing the reports as exaggerations or northern propaganda designed to damage the South. When prisoners died in numbers that should have scandalized the nation, The deaths were explained away as the natural consequences of working with dangerous criminals, as if the men in the mines were hardened murderers rather than vagrants and petty offenders. The companies produced statistics showing that death rates in their operations were comparable to death rates in free mining operations. Statistics that were false, that required creative accounting, that compared convict mines to the most dangerous free operations rather than to industry averages. The lies were told confidently and repeatedly, and enough people believed them or pretended to believe them that reform remained impossible for decades. Some prisoners testified when they got the chance, their words preserved in investigations that led to nothing, in court proceedings that changed nothing, in newspaper articles that were read and forgotten. They described the whippings in detail, the number of lashes, the implements used, the guards who administered them with obvious pleasure, the injuries that festered and became infected, the men who died from punishment that was supposed to correct behavior. They described men dying in the mines, crushed by rock, burned by explosions, worked until they collapsed, their bodies left where they fell until the shift ended. They described the hunger and the cold and the heat and the disease, the constant presence of death, the absence of hope, the feeling of being worked to death by a system that valued coal more than human life. Their words were recorded, filed away, used to generate brief moments of outrage that never translated into meaningful reform, and then forgotten until historians rediscovered them decades later. The system finally ended not because of moral awakening, but because of economic calculation. As the 20th century progressed, the convict leasing system became less profitable and more troublesome. Free laborers, including immigrants and poor whites willing to work for low wages, became available in larger numbers. The bad publicity surrounding convict deaths created occasional problems for the companies. Most importantly, the state realized it could extract even more value by using convict labor directly on public works projects rather than leasing it to private companies. Alabama formally ended convict leasing in 1928, one of the last states to do so, but it replaced the system with chain gangs and prison farms that continued many of the same abuses under different names. The men who survived the mines carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. The physical damage was obvious. Lungs destroyed by coal dust, bodies broken by labor, injuries that never healed properly. The psychological scars were less visible, but equally permanent. Nightmares that never stopped, an inability to trust, a flinching response to authority that made normal life difficult. Some men couldn't talk about what they'd experienced. Others couldn't stop talking about it, needing to witness, needing someone to know. Most died before anyone thought to record their stories in any systematic way, their experiences buried with them, the full truth of the convict leasing system, known only to those who lived it. The mines themselves are mostly abandoned now, shafts collapsed or sealed, the coal exhausted, or no longer profitable to extract. The camps where men suffered and died have rotted back into the earth, leaving few traces, no monuments, no acknowledgement of what happened there. The companies that profited have been renamed, merged, dissolved, their connection to convict leasing buried in corporate histories that prefer not to remember. The descendants of the men who died in those mines often don't know the full story of how their ancestors suffered, the records incomplete, the history deliberately obscured. But the system's effects echo forward through time in ways that are still being understood. The wealth extracted from convict labor-funded developments that shaped modern Alabama and the modern South. The patterns of incarceration established during the convict leasing era, the criminalization of black existence, the use of the justice system as a labor recruitment mechanism, these patterns didn't disappear when the leasing ended. They evolved, adapted, found new expressions in mass incarceration, in prison labor programs, in the ongoing overrepresentation of black Americans in the criminal justice system. The convict leasing system was not an aberration. It was a template. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about the men who descended into those mines, who swung picks in the darkness, who breathed coal dust until their lungs gave out. Think about Green Cottenham, whose story was documented in Douglas Blackman's book Slavery by Another Name. Arrested for vagrancy in 1908, sold to a mining company, worked in conditions that killed so many others. Think about the thousands whose names we don't know, whose deaths weren't recorded, whose suffering generated the wealth that built industries and fortunes. Think about what it means that this happened in America, after emancipation, in a country that claimed to believe in freedom. But think also about the fact that some survived. Against odds that should have been insurmountable, some men made it through their sentences, walked out of the camps, returned to lives that would never be the same, but that were still lives. They carried witness even when no one wanted to hear. They told their children and grandchildren, kept the memory alive, refused to let the system erase itself completely. The convict leasing system tried to consume them entirely, to turn them into fuel for industry, to extract every bit of value and discard the rest. It failed. Not in the sense that it didn't cause immense suffering, because it did, but in the sense that it couldn't destroy the humanity of the men it tried to destroy. That persistence, that survival, that refusal to be completely erased is what we remember tonight. Let it carry you into peaceful sleep. Let's start at the beginning, before the first ship ever crossed the Atlantic, with human cargo in its hold. The year is somewhere in the early 1400s, and the Portuguese are poking their way down the western coast of Africa, looking for gold and a sea route to the spice markets of Asia. Prince Henry the Navigator, sitting in his palace on the southwestern tip of Europe, is sending expedition after expedition into waters that European sailors had feared for centuries. They're not initially thinking about slavery on a massive scale. That's not the plan. The plan is wealth through trade, through finding new routes to old riches. Slavery existed in Europe, existed in Africa, existed in Asia, existed pretty much everywhere humans had figured out that forcing other humans to work was profitable. But it was relatively small-scale, local, often temporary. Enslaved people in medieval Europe were often white, taken from Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean borderlands. The word slave itself derives from Slav, a reminder of who filled that category in earlier centuries. What the Portuguese stumbled into would become something entirely different, something unprecedented in human history. They found the gold they were looking for, establishing trading relationships with African kingdoms that had been mining the precious metal for generations. And they found something else too, a coastline stretching thousands of miles, populated by diverse kingdoms and peoples, some of whom were willing to trade captives for European goods. At first the trade was modest, a few captives here and there, exchanged for textiles and metal tools and trinkets that seemed valuable to both parties. These early captives were transported back to Portugal, where they worked as domestic servants and labourers, curiosities as much as commodities. Others went to the newly colonised Atlantic islands, Madeira and the Canaries, and eventually São Tomé, where sugar plantations were beginning to transform the landscape and create an appetite for labour that local populations couldn't satisfy. Nobody knew it yet, but they were laying the foundation for a system that would consume millions of lives and reshape the world. Here's where geography and economics collide to create catastrophe. Christopher Columbus bumbles his way across the Atlantic in 1492, thinking he's found Asia, actually finding the Caribbean. Within decades, the Spanish are colonizing islands and mainlands, discovering that the indigenous populations are dying at catastrophic rates from European diseases, from brutal labor conditions, from the general violence of conquest. The Spanish need workers. They need bodies to mine silver, to grow sugar, to build the infrastructure of empire. And they need them in numbers that the decimated indigenous populations can no longer provide. The solution arrives from across the ocean. African captives, already being traded in small numbers, suddenly become the answer to a labor crisis of colonial making. The first enslaved Africans arrive in the Americas in the early 1500s, and the floodgates begin to crack open. Now let's talk about how this actually worked, because the slave trade wasn't a simple transaction. It was a complex system involving multiple continents, dozens of nations, countless middlemen, and economic incentives so powerful they overwhelmed whatever moral objections might have existed. The trade operated on what historians call the triangular route, though the reality was messier than any neat geometric shape. Ships left European ports loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, metal tools, weapons, alcohol, beads, and countless other items. They sailed to the West African coast, where these goods were exchanged for human beings. The ships then crossed the Atlantic, the infamous Middle Passage, carrying their human cargo to the Americas. There, the surviving captives were sold, and the ships loaded up with colonial products, sugar, tobacco, cotton, rum, and sailed back to Europe to complete the triangle. Each leg of the journey generated profit. Each leg depended on the others. The whole system was elegantly horrible in its economic efficiency. But we need to slow down and look at what was actually happening on the African coast, because the story is more complicated than Europeans simply raiding villages and grabbing people. That happened, especially in the early years, but it wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't how most of the trade actually functioned. Instead, Europeans established trading posts along the coast, fortified positions where they could store goods and captives, negotiate with local powers, and wait for the ships that would carry their purchases across the ocean. They called these factories, though nothing was manufactured there except human misery. The captives who ended up in these factories came from the interior, often marched hundreds of miles from their homes, sold through networks of African traders and rulers who had their own reasons for participating in the trade. Here's a truth that makes some people uncomfortable, but needs to be told honestly. African participation in the slave trade was real and significant. Some African kingdoms grew wealthy and powerful by capturing and selling their neighbors. Some rulers traded war captives, criminals, or people from rival ethnic groups, not fully understanding or not caring about the scale of what they were feeding. Some were coerced, facing European military pressure or economic dependency that left them few choices. The dynamics varied enormously across time and place, and it would be wrong to either excuse European responsibility by pointing to African participation, or to pretend that Africans were simply victims with no agency in the process. The trade corrupted everyone it touched. It incentivized warfare, raiding, and kidnapping across vast stretches of the continent. It destabilized societies and distorted economies. It turned human beings into the most valuable export commodity Africa possessed, with consequences that would echo for centuries. Now imagine yourself as one of the captured. You're going about your life in a village somewhere in the interior, maybe farming millet or yams. maybe herding cattle, maybe working as a craftsman or trader, maybe just existing in the rhythms of ordinary days that had structured your family's life for generations. You have a name, a history, a place in a community that knows you. You have relationships, obligations, hopes for the future, and then everything ends. Maybe raiders attack at dawn, burning homes and grabbing anyone they can catch. Professional slave hunters who have done this before and will do it again. Maybe you're taken in a war between neighboring peoples, a war that might have happened anyway, but is now fueled by the knowledge that captives mean wealth, that European traders will pay well for the people on the losing side. Maybe you're sold by your own community for a crime real or invented, or to settle a debt, or because a local chief needs trade goods more than he needs you, or because famine has made every mouth a burden, and yours can be exchanged for something that might help others survive. However it happens, the result is the same. You find yourself bound, hands tied behind your back, or neck locked into a wooden yoke that connects you to the person in front of you and the person behind. You're marched away from everything you've ever known, joined by dozens or hundreds of others in the same terrible situation. The march to the coast could take weeks or months depending on where you started. You walk until your feet bleed, then you walk on the bleeding feet, because stopping isn't an option. You're fed barely enough to keep you moving, often just enough to prevent you from collapsing entirely. The guards watch constantly, armed and willing to kill anyone who can't continue, anyone who tries to escape, anyone who causes too much trouble. Some people die on these marches, from exhaustion, from disease, from despair so deep it simply stops the heart. Some people escape, slipping away in the night, and somehow making it back to what's left of home. Most just keep walking, stunned by the catastrophe that has overtaken their lives, unable to fully process what is happening or what it means. You pass through villages that watch you go, some hostile, some sympathetic, all powerless to help. You cross rivers and climb hills and traverse landscapes that grow increasingly unfamiliar. The vegetation changes, the language changes, the faces around you change as some captives are sold off and others are added to the coffle. By the time you reach the coast, you may have been walking for 2 months. You may have lost a third of the people who started the journey with you. You may have forgotten what it felt like to not be exhausted, to not be hungry, to not be afraid. You reach the coast and you see the ocean for the first time. If you're from the interior, as most captives were, you might never have seen so much water, might not have known such a thing was possible. The endless expanse of it, stretching to the horizon in every direction, must have seemed like the edge of the world, and in a sense, it was. Everything you knew was behind you. Everything ahead was unknown, unimaginable, terrifying. The European trading post looms ahead. Stone walls and cannons, strange pale men with stranger clothes speaking languages you can't understand. These fortified positions dotted the West African coast, each one a node in the network that was draining the continent of its people. They had names that would become infamous: Elmina, Cape Coast, Gore, Bunce Island. They had dungeons beneath them where captives waited in darkness for the ships that would carry them away. You're inspected like livestock, your teeth checked for signs of age or disease, your muscles squeezed to assess your capacity for labor, your body examined for defects that might lower your price. Men had their genitals inspected. Women had their breasts examined. Children were measured against standards that determined whether they counted as full cargo or partial. The humiliation was systematic, designed to reduce you from a person to a product, to begin the process of dehumanization that would continue for the rest of your life. If you pass inspection, you're purchased, your price calculated in units of trade goods, so many yards of cloth, so many iron bars, so many guns, so much alcohol. If you don't pass, your fate might be worse, left to die in the dungeons, or sold to local buyers for whatever they'll pay. The ones who are bought are branded, literally burned with hot irons to mark them as property of this or that trading company, the initials seared into shoulder or chest or breast. The pain is searing and the scar is permanent, a mark you'll carry forever, a symbol of what has been done to you that can never be erased. Then you wait. You wait in dungeons beneath the trading posts, dark and airless spaces where hundreds of people are crammed together, waiting for the ship that will carry you away from everything. The dungeons at Cape Coast Castle could hold 1,000 captives at a time. The dungeons at Elmina were tunnels carved into rock, dripping with moisture, crawling with vermin. The waiting could last weeks or even months, depending on when the next ship arrived and how long it took to fill its hold. People died in those dungeons, from disease, from despair, from the sheer impossibility of processing what was happening to them. Some went mad. Some found ways to end their own lives. The survivors boarded the ships and faced something even worse. The Middle Passage. Those two words contain more suffering than any phrase should be asked to hold. The journey from Africa to the Americas typically took 6 to 8 weeks, though weather and circumstance could stretch it to 3 months or more. During that time, captives were packed into the holds of ships in conditions that defy description, though we'll try anyway, because bearing witness matters, because looking away is its own form of complicity. The ships were designed to maximize cargo, and the cargo was human beings. Naval architects debated the most efficient way to pack bodies into wooden hulls, some favoring loose packing that might reduce mortality, others preferring tight packing that would deliver more survivors even if the death rate was higher. The debate was conducted in the language of commerce, not humanity. People were chained together in rows, iron shackles around ankles and wrists, forced to lie on wooden platforms with barely enough space to turn over, stacked in tiers like merchandise in a warehouse. The space allotted to each person was sometimes no more than 16 inches wide and 5.5 feet long. Less room than a coffin provides. The height between decks might be only 4 or 5 feet, not enough for an adult to stand. You lay there in the darkness, pressed against strangers who had become intimate by proximity, if nothing else, feeling the ship roll beneath you, hearing sounds you couldn't identify, smelling smells you wished you couldn't. The heat below decks was suffocating, the tropical Atlantic providing no relief, the bodies of hundreds of people generating warmth that had nowhere to go. Ventilation was minimal, often just a few grates in the deck above that let in some air and some light, but never enough of either. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat, of waste, of vomit, of fear, of death. People relieved themselves where they lay because there was nowhere else to do it, the waste accumulating beneath them, seeping through the boards, creating conditions that bred disease with terrible efficiency. The captives were brought above deck occasionally for air and exercise, forced to dance to keep their muscles from atrophying completely, whipped if they didn't move with sufficient enthusiasm. It was a grotesque parody of human activity, serving the purely economic purpose of delivering healthy merchandise to market. The crews didn't enjoy the voyages either, though their suffering was nothing compared to what lay below decks. They got sick from the same diseases that ravaged the captives. They lived in fear of the uprisings that occurred on roughly 1 in 10 voyages. They developed psychological strategies for not thinking about what they were doing, not looking at the people in the hold as people, not questioning a trade that paid their wages, Some of them were brutal, taking out frustrations on captives who couldn't fight back. Others tried to maintain some minimal standard of treatment, not from compassion, but from the understanding that dead cargo meant lost profit. The ships themselves became saturated with the trade, the wood soaked with odors that never fully dissipated, vessels known as slavers, even when they carried other cargo. Disease swept through the ships like fire through dry grass. Dysentery was endemic, people lying in their own waste and the waste of those chained beside them, because there was nowhere else for it to go. Smallpox appeared and spread in the close quarters, killing some and scarring others. Fevers of various kinds took their toll. The crews got sick too, though they at least had access to fresh air and better food. Mortality rates on the Middle Passage varied depending on the ship, the route, the era, and sheer luck, but something like 15% of captives died during the crossing on average. That's nearly 2 million people who never reached the Americas, whose bodies were thrown overboard to feed the sharks that learned to follow the slave ships, who died in chains in the darkness of a ship's hold, thousands of miles from home. Some captives chose death rather than continue. They refused to eat, forcing the crews to use devices that pried open their jaws and forced food down their throats. Some threw themselves overboard when they got the chance, choosing the ocean over whatever waited on the other side. Let's talk about the scale, because numbers this large can become abstractions if we're not careful. Over the 4 centuries that the transatlantic slave trade operated, approximately 12 million Africans were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 10.5 million survived the crossing. They came from regions stretching from present-day Senegal to Angola, from ethnic groups speaking hundreds of different languages, practicing different religions, carrying different traditions. They were Yoruba and Igbo, Akan and Fon, Congo and Mbundu, and dozens of other peoples whose names and histories were systematically erased by a system that didn't care who you were, only what you could produce. The trade peaked in the 1700s, when ships were crossing the Atlantic at a pace that would have been unimaginable a century earlier, when the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil had an appetite for labor that seemed bottomless, when the whole Atlantic economy ran on the fuel of stolen lives. Now let's follow the survivors to their destinations, because the Middle Passage was not the end of the horror. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would last the rest of their lives and the lives of their descendants for generations to come. The ships arrived at ports throughout the Americas: Rio de Janeiro and Bahia in Brazil, Havana and Santiago in Cuba, Kingston and Bridgetown in the Caribbean, Charleston and New Orleans, and 100 smaller harbors where human beings were unloaded and prepared for sale. The captives were cleaned up, their wounds treated or hidden with tar and oil, their bodies oiled to make them look healthier than they were. Some were given better food for a few days, fattened up like livestock before market. Grey hair was dyed black. Signs of disease were concealed. Everything was done to maximize the price. They were marched to auction blocks where planters and merchants and speculators gathered to inspect them, handling them like animals, checking teeth and muscles, looking for signs of defiance or docility, making judgments about how much labor could be extracted from each body. Families that had managed to stay together through the capture and the march and the dungeons and the crossing were separated here, sold to different buyers, sent to different plantations, sometimes to different colonies hundreds of miles apart. Children were torn from mothers, the screaming audible to everyone present, ignored by everyone with the power to prevent it. Husbands were separated from wives who they would never see again. Siblings were scattered like seeds in the wind. the social bonds that had survived everything else were deliberately destroyed, because isolated individuals were easier to control than people with connections and loyalties and networks of support. The destinations shaped the experience of slavery in ways that mattered enormously, even though all slavery was brutal by definition. Most enslaved Africans ended up in Brazil or the Caribbean, where sugar was king, and the labor regime was designed to extract maximum production regardless of human cost. Sugar was the oil of its era, the commodity that Europeans craved, the foundation of fortunes and empires, and it was produced under conditions that can only be described as industrial murder. The sugar plantations were killing fields. Work in the cane fields was brutal, dangerous, and unrelenting. The cane had to be cut during a narrow harvest window, meaning 18-hour days during the busiest season. The stalks were sharp and tough. The sun was relentless. The overseers were quick with the whip. The processing of sugar was even, more dangerous than the fieldwork. Boiling cane juice in massive copper vats required round-the-clock labor near open flames and scalding liquids. Workers lost arms to the grinding mills that crushed the cane. They suffered horrible burns from splashing syrup. They collapsed from exhaustion and heat and were dragged aside so the work could continue. Injuries were common. Death was common. The planters calculated that it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and buy replacements than to treat them well enough to live long lives. This wasn't hidden. It was openly discussed in the economic literature of the time, debated as a matter of business strategy. In some Caribbean colonies, the enslaved population couldn't reproduce itself. More people died than were born, and the population was only maintained through constant importation of new captives from Africa. This is what the economics of sugar created, a perpetual death machine fed by the Middle Passage. North America received a smaller share of the trade, perhaps 400,000 captives total, but developed its own horrific variation. The enslaved population in what would become the United States did reproduce and grow, reaching nearly 4 million by the time of the Civil War, all descended from that original 400,000. This meant that North American slavery became self-sustaining in a way that Caribbean slavery never did, less dependent on the Atlantic trade, but no less brutal in its daily operation. The cotton plantations of the Deep South, which boomed after the invention of the cotton gin, created their own version of the sugar plantation's deadly efficiency. And throughout the Americas, in every colony and nation that practiced slavery, the same fundamental reality applied. Human beings were property, their labor was extracted by force, and their lives were valued only insofar as they produced wealth for others. The trade itself was enormously profitable for those who ran it. European merchants grew rich on the buying and selling of human beings. Port cities like Liverpool, Nantes, and Amsterdam flourished on the proceeds. Banks and insurance companies that still exist today got their start financing slave voyages and insuring their human cargo. The wealth generated by the slave trade and slave labor flowed into the broader European economy, funding industrialization, building mansions, endowing universities, creating the material foundation for the modern world. This isn't speculation or exaggeration. It's documented history, traceable in account books and shipping records, visible in the grand buildings that still stand in cities that would rather forget how the money was made. Let's talk about resistance, because the enslaved people of the Atlantic world never simply accepted their fate. From the moment of capture to the last days of slavery, resistance took many forms, from the dramatic to the everyday, from armed rebellion to quiet sabotage, from running away to maintaining cultural practices that the enslavers wanted to destroy. On the ships of the Middle Passage, uprisings occurred regularly enough that crews lived in constant fear, armed themselves heavily, and developed elaborate security procedures to prevent the captives from ever having an opportunity to act together. The men were kept in chains almost constantly. The women, often left unchained because they were considered less dangerous, sometimes used that relative freedom to steal weapons or relay information between groups of captives. Most shipboard rebellions failed. Put down with brutal violence, the leaders executed in ways designed to terrorize the survivors into submission. They were shot, hanged from the mast, dismembered and thrown overboard piece by piece, while others were forced to watch. The punishment was spectacular because it had to be. The crews were always outnumbered by their cargo, and they knew that only fear kept them in control. But some rebellions succeeded. Some ships were taken over by their captives, turned around, sailed back toward Africa by people who had never operated a European vessel before, but figured it out because the alternative was unbearable. The records of these successful uprisings are scarce because no one wanted to advertise that the trade could be disrupted, but they happened, and they mattered. In the Americas, rebellions erupted throughout the centuries of slavery. Too many to count, too important to ignore. Some were small and quickly crushed. Handfuls of enslaved people on single plantations who rose up against their immediate oppressors and were overwhelmed by the military force that colonial powers could bring to bear. Others shook colonial societies to their foundations, spreading across wide areas, lasting for months, requiring armies to suppress. Jamaica saw major rebellions repeatedly, the mountainous interior providing refuge for maroon communities of escaped slaves who fought the British to a standstill, and eventually won treaties recognizing their autonomy. Brazil had Palmares, a confederation of escaped slave settlements that lasted nearly a century, and at its height numbered tens of thousands of people. The colonial authorities eventually destroyed it, but for generations it stood as proof that another way of living was possible. The Haitian Revolution stands as the most successful slave revolt in history, a transformation so complete that it still astonishes. Beginning in 1791 and culminating in independence in 1804, it saw enslaved people defeat the armies of France, Spain, and Britain, destroying the most profitable colony in the Caribbean and establishing the first nation founded by former slaves. The revolution was led by men like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, former slaves who became generals and statesmen, who outmaneuvered European powers and created something unprecedented. It terrified slaveholders throughout the Americas who saw in Haiti a vision of what might happen if they lost control. It inspired enslaved people everywhere, proving that the system could be overthrown, that freedom could be seized rather than granted. The ripple effects influenced everything from the Louisiana Purchase to the hardening of slave codes throughout the American South, as slaveholders responded to their fear with increased brutality. But even smaller acts of resistance mattered. Running away, even when recapture was likely, asserted that the enslaved person was a human being who desired freedom, not a contented piece of property. Breaking tools slowed down production and cost the enslaver money. Working slowly, feigning illness, pretending not to understand instructions, all of these were ways of reclaiming small pieces of autonomy within a system of total domination. Maintaining African cultural practices, speaking African languages, practicing African religions or syncretic versions that blended African and Christian elements. These were ways of preserving identity against a system that wanted to reduce human beings to interchangeable units of labor. Learning to read despite prohibitions, which happened far more often than the enslavers realized, was an act of rebellion that opened doors to other forms of resistance. Every act of resistance, from the largest rebellion to the smallest act of defiance, was a refusal to accept the terms the enslavers tried to impose. The end of the trade came gradually, driven by a complex mixture of moral awakening, economic calculation, political pressure, and the resistance of enslaved people themselves. Britain, which had been one of the largest slave trading nations, accumulating enormous wealth from the traffic in human beings, abolished the trade in 1807 and then spent decades using its naval power to suppress the trade by others. The West Africa Squadron patrolled the African coast, intercepting slave ships and freeing their captives, though the freed people often ended up in British colonies as nominally free labourers whose conditions weren't always much better than slavery. The British motivation was partly genuine abolitionism, the result of decades of activist campaigning led by people like William Wilberforce and Olaudah Equiano, a former slave whose autobiography helped turn public opinion against the trade. The abolitionists made slavery a moral issue in ways it hadn't been before, forcing people to confront the reality of what the trade involved, using images and testimony and economic arguments to build a movement that eventually became politically irresistible. But British motivation was also partly economic self-interest. Britain had transitioned to different forms of colonial exploitation, finding that wage labour in some contexts was actually more profitable than slave labour, especially when someone else was bearing the costs of housing and feeding the workers. Having already accumulated enormous capital from the slave trade and slave-produced commodities, Britain found it convenient to handicap competitors who still relied on the trade, to claim moral superiority while enforcing economic disadvantage. The reality was messier than either a purely moral or purely economic explanation would suggest. Both factors were present, intertwined, impossible to fully separate. The United States banned the importation of enslaved Africans in the same year, 1807, though slavery itself continued for another 6 decades, and an illegal trade persisted in smaller volumes. Ships still landed cargoes of captives on American shores throughout the antebellum period, their captains and crews risking prosecution for profits that made the risk worthwhile. The domestic slave trade, the buying and selling of people already in America, continued legally and massively, with an estimated 1 million enslaved people forcibly moved from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860. This internal trade was in some ways even more traumatic than the Middle Passage, because it separated families who had known each other, communities that had been together for generations, people who had built lives that were destroyed for the profit of others. The last slave ship to land in the United States arrived in 1860, just a year before the Civil War began. The Clotilda carried over 100 captives from West Africa to Alabama, its cargo quickly hidden and the ship burned to destroy evidence. The survivors lived for decades, and the last of them, a woman named Ridoshi, died in 1937, a living link to the Middle Passage in living memory. Brazil didn't fully end its participation until 1888, the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. By then, the trade had been declining for decades, squeezed by naval patrols, changing economics, and the slow spread of abolition across the hemisphere. Cuba and Puerto Rico had ended slavery in the 1870s and 1880s. The British Caribbean had been free since the 1830s. The American Civil War had destroyed slavery in the United States, but 4 centuries of damage couldn't be undone by legislation. The 12 million people who crossed the Atlantic, the millions more who died before they could be loaded onto ships, the societies disrupted across Africa, the wealth extracted and accumulated in Europe and the Americas, all of this had reshaped the world in ways that persist to the present day. Let's talk about the legacy, because the transatlantic slave trade didn't just end. It echoed. The descendants of those 12 million captives are everywhere in the Americas, from Brazil to Canada. Their presence a testament to survival against impossible odds. The cultures they created, forged from African roots and American realities, transformed music, religion, language, and cuisine across the hemisphere. The wealth extracted from their labor built institutions and fortunes that still structure economic power today. And the racism developed to justify the trade, the ideology that black people were inferior and deserving of enslavement, didn't disappear when the last ship docked. It adapted, evolved, found new expressions in segregation, discrimination, and the countless ways that societies built on slavery continued to devalue black lives. Africa itself was transformed in ways that are still being untangled. The trade depopulated regions, disrupted political systems, incentivized warfare and instability. It drained the continent of millions of people during precisely the centuries when Europe was industrializing and gaining the technological advantages that would enable colonization. The relationship between the slave trade and Africa's subsequent colonial experience is complex, but the two are clearly connected, the one laying groundwork for the other. The borders drawn by European colonizers, the ethnic tensions exacerbated by colonial policies, the economic structures oriented toward extraction rather than development, all of these have roots that reach back to the era of the slave trade. And what of the survivors themselves? The ones who endured the capture, survived the march, lived through the Middle Passage, and built lives under slavery. They carried trauma that we're only beginning to understand how to talk about. They also carried knowledge, skills, traditions, and memories that they passed down to children, who would pass them to their children in turn. The cultural persistence of African traditions in the Americas, visible in music and dance and food and religious practice, represents an act of preservation against a system designed to erase everything. Every drumbeat that echoes African rhythms, every spiritual that encodes African religious concepts in Christian language, every word in American languages that traces back to Yoruba or Kikongo or Wolof, is evidence that the enslaved people refused to be completely unmade. They survived, they remembered, they created. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about the scale of what we've discussed. 12 million people, 400 years, 3 continents, countless lives lived under conditions of unimaginable brutality. Think about the resistance, the survival, the persistence of humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. Think about the wealth generated and where it went, the poverty created and where it stayed. Think about the long shadow that falls across the present from those centuries of horror, visible in economic inequality, in racial injustice, in the very maps and borders that define our world. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't ancient history that ended cleanly. It was the foundation of the modern world, and we're still living in the house it built. But think also of the survivors. Think of the people who lived through the Middle Passage and found ways to continue. Think of their descendants, who number in the hundreds of millions today, who created cultures and communities, who fought for freedom and often won. Think of the resilience it took to build anything at all from the wreckage the trade left behind. That resilience is the other legacy, the one that stands against the horror, that insists on life and beauty and hope even in the darkest circumstances. The trade tried to reduce human beings to commodities, to units of labor, to entries in a ledger. It failed. The people it tried to destroy are still here, still remembering, still creating, still refusing to be erased. Let that thought carry you into peaceful sleep, holding both the weight of the history and the persistence of those who survived it.